Hello and welcome to the channel. Today I'm Will and I'm going to be talking about my favourite historical fantasy books of all time. 7 of them to be precise, in no particular order, just chatting about my favourites. I love the genre of historical fantasy. I love fantasy, I love historical fiction. Sandwich them together, what's not to love? And so I imagine everyone knows, but just in case, historical fantasy, it's set in the real world in the past, but it's got a fantastical element. And the author often brings into play kind of the idea that magic did exist, or it does exist, but we just don't realise it. It's kept a secret or done in this way or that, as I will talk about with these individual books. And it is great to see that this genre is getting more popular. And I think there's nothing else to say, really. What's more important and interesting is the books. And so let's get straight on into it with one of my favourite books of all time, in Babel by A.R.F. Kuang. So this is set in the 19th century. Our main protagonist, Robert Swift, he is orphaned and is brought from Canton to Oxford University by a mysterious guardian. And this is a book that looks at the actual translation for the British Empire. And it is a huge question of the morality of doing so. And it is a book that has brilliant characters. We've got kind of the fairy tale Oxford, but there is a dark underlining to it. And we've got the Tower of Babel, and this is where the fantastical element comes in. And I'm actually not going to say too much about it, because that is part of the journey of this book, you discovering the magic. But I will say it lies in words, in translation, and there I think that's a message from A.R.F. Kuang about the power of language, and she embodies that, manifests into magic. And this is a book that is very compelling and is very fascinating. A.R.F. Kuang just shows that she is a brilliant author. She has written the Poppy War trilogy, Yellowface and Babel, and all 3 of those, they adopt a very different writing style, very different themes, very different sort of character, and very different pacing as well. And so she really shows that she's a master of her craft. And with this historical fantasy, I think, in my opinion, it is just perfect for what she is trying to achieve and the type of book that this is. It is one that will immerse you. You will be transported. And it's also thought-provoking. A.R.F. Kuang will force you to think of the answers to these questions, which many of them don't have a categorical answer, but it's things and topics to think about. And yeah, it is gripping. It does not let go. And it is a book that will stay with you long after you close the final page. And so yeah, that is Babel. Sorry if I'm pronouncing it wrong. And then next up, I'm going to talk about, first up, I will talk about some mythology. This is Silence of the Girls, and this is almost entirely a historical retelling of Troy, but from the perspective of Briseis, the Trojan noblewoman who is taken captive and handed to Achilles. And so we've seen the Trojan retelling in films and books and programs many a time, but this is my favourite of them all. It is an incredible retelling that is stark, it is brutal, but it is so moving. And it is almost entirely historical, but every now and then, just a demigod or a god might just appear. Doesn't really have that big of a role, but it shows that the world we're in is fantastical, because you don't really have kind of half mermaids swimming out the sea every now and then. But this is one of my favourite books of all time. Book 3 actually comes out in a few months, The Voyage Home by Pat Barker, which I cannot wait for. But this is a book that Pat Barker's writing style reminds me a lot of Elodie Harper's The Wolf Den. If you've read that, I'm not sure if Elodie Harper was inspired by her, but it's very similar in that our characters, they are thrust into positions where they basically have no power. And these women have to just fight for survival day to day. And that means that it is such a tense read. But I also love how that is explored through the prose. They do it in a way where it is just that day to day. They're not thinking long term. And I love how when we get in those scenes of specific danger, the prose is just stripped back. It is just what the character is viewing and their attempt to try and get out of this situation. And that is, I've explained it really badly, but what I'm trying to say is I just respect the craft of this so much. And it is my favourite mythological retelling. It is my favourite retelling of any media form of Troy. And so that on its own should speak volumes, because I have read so many, and so hopefully this is a recommendation that you're intrigued to pick up. If any of these I could recommend to someone and force them to pick up, it would be this, because just more people need to talk about it, and I want to talk about the books I love with other people, and that's what this channel is for at the end of the day. And one of my first reviews on the channel was of The Silence of the Girl, so you can check that out if you want. I also do a review of Babel as well. So yeah, they're both up reviewed on the channel if you want to check them out. But next up, I have 3 historical fantasy books that I will talk about kind of together because coincidentally, they all feature the Mongol Empire. And so first up, I've got The Judas Blossom by Stephen Orion. So this is the Mongol Empire, I believe, in the 13th century. Yes, it is, because I think it is just before the peak size-wise of the Mongol Empire, which I believe was the 1270s or something. Oh yeah, it's the 1260s, there we go. And so that probably would have been easier to just read the back. So this is a book where it's multi-POV. We've got an array of characters set mostly in Persia. And we've got characters who, they're leaders of Mongol armies, they're members who want to bring down the Mongol Empire down. We've got a secret organisation trying to keep their city alive. And we've got characters from all walks of life. And I absolutely love that, because often I find in historical fiction and historical fantasy, you only really follow the major players. But in this, you've got a wide mix where you've got those who have armies under their control, and then those just striving for their own individual survival, who come not from the nobility, but are just trying to survive the circumstances that are thrown their way, and they are sucked into the main plot and narrative of this story. And so this is brilliant. I really love that Stephen Ryan has adopted kind of a writing style that really reflects the period we're in. It is immersive, but it's also quite stripped back, so it is efficient. We move forward with this story at a great pace, but also we have those slower moments for character development. And there is basically no magic in the Judas Blossom. I expect there will be more in book 2, which is coming out soon, and I believe it's called The Blood-Dimmed Tide, which, what a name, by the way. I think that is foreboding what is to come, but yeah, foreshadowing, I mean, not foreboding. It is foreboding, but it's foreshadowing what is to come. And so, yeah, The Judas Blossom, another one that is on this video. So it's historical fantasy that I love and that I highly recommend. And so 2 others that feature the Mongol Empire as well are She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chan. This is set in the 14th century. And so I believe that is more towards the decline of the Mongol Empire. And this is set in China. We've got a character who, she is a daughter of a very poor family, and her brother is kind of seen, I think he's the 8th son, and he's seen as kind of the chosen one of the family. He's going to have a very successful career. But there's a bandit raid, the brother is killed. And so she, this young girl, she takes this chance to adopt his identity, and she tries to use that to kind of forge her own path forward. So going against what is set out for her in life. And this is one that becomes very epic. It is historical fantasy. There is a fantastical element, very prevalent at times. But again, it's not the main focus. In all of these, I think the historicalness is the main focus. And the fantastical element comes in to add like flair to it. And it isn't very pivotal to the narrative, but it is kind of more the seasoning, really, on top of the historical exploration of these books. And the ending in particular, I read this 3 years ago now, and I can remember the ending as clear as day. And I don't know how I haven't read book 2 yet, which I've actually forgotten the name of. It came out last year, and I really do need to read it. And yeah, that is She Who Became the Sun. And then the final one featuring the Mongol Empire I'm talking about is The Bear and the Nightingale trilogy by Catherine Arden. So this is set in Russia, in the land of the Rus, and I believe this is also 14th century. Another dominion, another realm under the control of the Mongol Empire, who are kind of fighting against that kind of repression and oppression. And we follow a character, a girl, who she can see the spirits of Russian folklore. And a lot of these, they're dying out because of the spread of other religions, Christianity taking hold. And these creatures, they survive by having offerings left out for them and kind of being believed in. And that's a trope we've seen before, but it is done so uniquely in this historical fantastical element. And I think I remember Petrick saying when he read this, it's the only book that's made him feel cold. And yeah, it really does. It's set in deep, dark, wintry Russia, and it is just really remarkable. Vasilia is an incredible main perspective. I love how she just refuses to give in to kind of the hegemonic values of the time. She's told time and time again, you cannot ride horses in public. You need to find someone to marry, and you just need to obey, really. But she's like, I don't think so. But she does it very differently in ways that we've seen in other books. She doesn't really try and make Adil, she just wants to stay on her own. She loves the spirits. She loves doing her own thing. She just doesn't really take no nonsense really from anyone else. And I love how this kind of plays into a bigger story within the small arc of the kind of the little village she lives in. And so there's a smaller conflict, but a much bigger epic one brewing in the background that comes to full fruition throughout the trilogy. But you could just read The Bear and the Nightingale as a standalone. I recommend reading the whole series, but if you just want a bit of a palate cleanser for now, just read book one, see if it's one for you, and you can leave it at that and feel very satisfied at the end of it. And then I've got two more. I've got The Children of Gods and Fighting Men by Shauna Lawless. This is set in very late 10th century Ireland. So we've got kind of the Irish and the Norse threat, and they're coming into conflict with each other. And we've got into this historical detail and historical conflicts. We've got the Irish mythological families added to it. And I absolutely love how we kind of follow these two families, or two kind of not organizations, but two different groups of kind of mythological families who they can both live for longer, they've got different powers, but they have an age-long enmity with each other. And one of them is basically undercover. There's only a few of them left, and the others, they're starting to lose their powers, but they feel quite safe. And so we've got one POV from each, and I'm trying to say an amazing part of this is basically not knowing what's going to happen. But I will say, I think Ed said that there's a new Cersei in town, as in Cersei from Madeline Miller's book, or Circe, however you pronounce it. I'm so bad at pronunciations, but he said there's a new Circe in town, and she's Irish, because there's a character in here which reminded him of her a lot, and that is Gormla. And there is an interview with Shauna Lawless on the Brothers Gwyn channel if you want to check that out, where we discuss this. No spoilers. And yeah, I don't want to say too much because it is political intrigue, and there is a big action sequence at the end, and I believe there's a lot more action in book 2, but mostly it's political intrigue, and they're the tensions that are being played with, and I love how that is done in such an engaging way, where I think that political intrigue, it can reap high rewards, but it can also be quite boring, and yeah, it's a fine line for authors, but Shauna Lawless does it brilliantly. And that is another one that, of course, I recommend because it's historical fantasy that I'm talking about today. The last one I don't have physically. It is a saga, actually. Sorry, my voice is going a bit. It is a saga, and it is Egil's saga. I think there is this misconception about the sagas and kind of epic poems like Beowulf, that they're really hard to access and they're really hard to understand. And basically, if you're not doing a degree, you shouldn't study them or read them. But I don't understand that misconception, because I believe the same thing. And then on the English literature list for Durham University, I'm in first year, there were quite a few sagas put on the list, and they were so easy and accessible to read that it really surprised me, and I just want to push the message for more people to read it, because it is wonderful. And Egil's saga is historical fantasy because they say it's historical, but Egil is also wielding massive axes at 7 years old and just doing magical things as well. There's spells and incantations. There's a bit that reminds me a bit of The Godfather involving a horse. So yeah. There's something like that, but it's played in a magical aspect. And so it kind of plays into the beliefs and traditions of the time. So you could read it as historical, but it's been played up. But I'm going to call it historical fantasy. And Egil Skallagrimsson as a feature character, as the titular character, is just fantastic to follow. He does some bad things. He does do some bad things. He's a very grey, ambiguous character, and he's probably one of the first anti-heroes, really. But he's one that you're rooting for, as Egil's saga is really, if you oversimplify it, a family saga about their enmity with the kings of Norway. And it is kind of about the freedom of Iceland, and that's kind of playing in the background. But the story of Egil, it is an individual story. It's not your typical fantasy story where you're kind of following this big plot, the plot of kind of nations, and they come into a big conflict, resolution. It's not like that. This is an individual saga where we see Egil, he plays a bit into the politics here, then he goes to another kingdom, he fights for Ethelstan in England. And that is why I believe, I haven't read the last book of The Last Kingdom by Bernard Cornwell yet, but he has come into play in the series already. And so it was awesome having read that already and then seeing him in Egil's saga, seeing where Bernard Cornwell got that inspiration. Love it. But yeah, this is a saga, very easy to read, very witty, very funny. It's often about the characters getting out of situations in crafty ways, and I love that kind of creativity and the unpredictability of the sagas as well. And Egil is the one that I've picked out as one of my favourites. And so, yeah, that is 7 historical fantasy works that I really advocate for people to read. They're my favourites, and I really hope that we see more historical fantasy coming along soon. I have no doubt we will, and I hope you pick some of these up. Let me know if you have already, and let me know if you intend to. Thank you, everyone, so much for watching, and stay safe.